Today we're going to talk about two other concepts that have to do with learning. One of those concepts is what we call conditioned or learned helplessness, and the other concept is called desensitization therapy. So let's take a look. They do not necessarily go together, but we're going to cover both of them in this screencast. So let's take a look at the first one, conditioned or learned helplessness. Now, in some textbooks, you will see it as conditioned helplessness. In others, you'll see it as learned helplessness. Just to remember, it's the exact same thing no matter which way you see it. The AP test could have either direction on it, but conditioned helplessness, conditioned simply means learned. Now, for dog lovers, beware of this one. This one's going to hurt a little bit. Years ago, back in 1967, they did a little experiment with two groups of dogs. And they put them in a cage, like such, that you see on the screen. And then they had a small barrier in the middle of the cage. And it was such that the dog could easily jump from one side to the other. That was not an issue. All right. Now, what they did is then they would shock one side of the cage. Now, well, let's talk about this first. We have two groups of dogs, okay? With the first group of dogs, we'll call them Group A. Group A, they were shocked on one side of the cage. So whatever side of the cage that Rover happens to be standing, this side here, they would shock that side of the cage. Now, we know that shock naturally and reliably produces fear and a jumping sensation. So what would happen is these dogs would eventually jump over the barrier to the other side of the cage, and the other side of the cage was safe. Okay, it was not being shocked. So later, after time had passed, no matter which side of the cage that the dogs were on, this is Group A, once again, they would shock that side of the cage again. So let's say that the dog happens to be here, they would shock this side, and again watch to see what the dog did. Now, it doesn't take too long to figure this out because Group A, those dogs are going to learn very quickly that to get to safety, they're going to jump that barrier because every single time they jump it, they end up being safe from the shock. So Group A dogs learned very quickly that they had control of their situation, for the most part, and as soon as shocks would begin, they would immediately jump. Now let's talk about Group B dogs. Okay, different group of dogs put in the exact same situation with one modification. In this case, they shock both sides of the cage. All right, so Group B, both sides of the cage are being shocked. Now, these dogs would jump around. They'd occasionally jump the barrier to no success, and eventually the shocks would stop. Okay, then later on, after a time passed, the cage would be shocked again. Now, it doesn't take too long to figure this one out either. Group B dogs eventually learned there was nothing they could do to help their situation. So literally, what ended up happening was those dogs would simply sit there and suffer, basically. They would cry through the experiment. Okay, this brings up the whole situation of what we call conditioned or learned helplessness. Now, what this is, it's basically learned apathy. Apathy, the idea that you just have you have no interest, you have no ability to fix your situation. But it's learned apathy in a situation where one's behavior has no effect on the reward or the punishment. In other words, the dogs in Group B learned that no matter what they did, they could not help themselves out. Now, let's finish that experiment. Okay, they took the dogs that were in Group B that had learned that they were helpless, and eventually they put them in the Group A scenario. So what that means is they basically put them in a situation where the one side of the cage was being shocked, but the other side was safe. Well, what happened was some of the dogs never even jumped the barrier because they didn't see any reason to. Some dogs that were jumping to try and avoid the shock, they would jump the barrier and they'd be in a safe situation on the other side of the barrier. But they never put two and two together. They never figured out that they were actually in control. So even though they had a good response, even though they had jumped to safety that time, they never figured out that they could do it again in the future. So conditioned helplessness is a very difficult situation because what ends up happening is the subject becomes very unmotivated. They become apathetic to try different responses. And even if they do try a response that's correct and it does bring relief or it does bring success, the subject has difficulty recognizing that their actions had anything to do with the outcome. Unfortunately, this can be put into use in human beings a lot. Human beings oftentimes, unfortunately, are put in situations where they feel that they have no impact on what's going to happen to them. Students sometimes can be in a classroom where they try and try and try as hard as they can, or at least they think they do. They try as hard as they can, and yet they still don't seem to be able to succeed. And what happens a lot of times is those students eventually just give up. They don't do anything. They feel like no matter what they do, it's not going to have impact on their scenario. And obviously that's not a good situation educationally. So, hopefully that's never happened to you, but, a lot of students are in that situation in some cases. All right, that's the first concept we're learning here, and that's, again, conditioned or learned helplessness. Let's talk about the second thing that we're going to look at here, and that's desensitization therapy. Desensitization, or sometimes it's referred to as exposure therapy. Okay, and this is basically a technique that's designed to gradually reduce fears or anxiety. And it uses deep muscle relaxation. It's based on the idea that somebody cannot be totally anxious and upset about something and yet be totally relaxed at the same time. Those are opposites. You cannot be both at the same time. So let's say, let's take an example here of either a mouse or a snake, and let's say that somebody's scared of, let's say they're scared of mice. Okay? If somebody's scared or afraid of mice, then we would say that they are sensitive to mice. So again, another way of remembering this is, what we're doing is we're going to try to desensitize that person. Or in other words, we're going to try and remove that sensitivity. Now, here's the deal. Let's say, again, that somebody's afraid of mice. So what you do is first teach the person how to totally relax. Okay, nothing else, just teach the person relaxation techniques. Once you get them to the point where they learn how to totally relax, then you bring in something that is remotely close to them, thinking about a mouse. I mean, it's not going to be anything drastic, but maybe you just show them the word mouse on a piece of paper and from across the room maybe. And all of a sudden they start to tense up. Well, then you go through the relaxation techniques again and get them to the point where even though there's the word mouse on this piece of paper, they can totally relax. Then you go a step further. So you're gradually getting closer and closer to that feared object. So maybe we show them a picture of a mouse on a piece of paper, and we go through the same process. And then next we maybe show them a movie that has a mouse in it. Okay, and then maybe we bring in a rubber mouse, and we just consistently keep going until eventually the goal is that you could literally show them a mouse and maybe have them hold the mouse or at least be right next to the mouse and not be afraid of it. Okay, but again, each time that you expose them to something that's closer to that feared object, you have to go through the relaxation process with them. Okay, so that they understand that they can actually have an impact there. Okay, they do this a lot of times with phobias, people who are afraid of various things. I know a lot of times they'll have people who are afraid of flying, and they'll have classes. Now the classes may last 6 or 8 weeks, but eventually they take it step by step by step and get the people to the point where not only can they get onto an airplane, but the final class is designed to take them up in an airplane, fly around for 10 or 15, 20 minutes, and then come back and land. And again, it's the whole thing is designed to get you over those fears. Now, if you understand that process and you understand how it works, you can almost do this even if you're not an expert. Okay, you can kind of run through the same kind of thing on your own, or like if a friend or family member has something that they're real afraid of, you could almost kind of talk to them and set up a thing where you could kind of help them through it, or they could help you through a fear that you have. It's a relatively easy thing to do. So desensitization, or sometimes called exposure therapy.